Welcome to Interview, a podcast for recruiters who are interested in thoughtful and practical discussions on issues, strategies, and disruptive technologies that are essentially impacting the staffing and recruitment industry. And our three experts are going to be first, John Geltema, who is our recruitment guru. He has over 20 years of experience representing high-level job seekers in their job search and negotiations. And John's going to bring the candidates and interviewees' perspective to the entire discussion. Our second expert is Mark Bassett, and he's going to be our executive search guru. He has over 25 years of experience hiring employees and contractors at, all different various levels of companies, ranging from startups to even Fortune 100 companies. And Mark is going to represent the clients in the hiring process, and he brings the employer's perspective to this discussion. And finally, our last expert is Debarshi Chowdhury, our technology guru with extensive experience building, reviewing, implementing recruitment tech, and even hiring hundreds of people to do it. Debarshi brings the tech employer's perspective to this discussion, and we'll also have invited guests contributing on their own specific topics of expertise in the future. So just go ahead and subscribe to the feed, and you'll be able to stay abreast of any upcoming topics and guests that we have on the show. In this episode, we will cover the very controversial and pertinent issues of salary and compensation negotiations. Now, we have spoken about how candidates, recruiters, and hiring managers should avoid this subject through the interview process, but obviously once both parties are interested in proceeding, we have to negotiate numbers. So in today's session, we will talk about how to navigate this potentially tricky part of the hiring process. So let's kick it off with the first question. Let's dive right into it. Now, how involved should the recruiter be in the compensation negotiation? And then we'll jump into what the candidate's job is, and the recruiter's job, and the hiring manager in the compensation negotiation process. I thought, John, maybe you want to kick it off with the candidate's point of view?
Absolutely. Actually, the overall view, both candidate and the hiring manager, I think it really comes down to the recruiter should get involved as much or as little as each one of the parties really needs. Ultimately, over years of experience, the more involved we can be comfortably, the more positive impact we can have at the negotiation at the end. So the involvement really does depend very much on the situation. Reality is, in most search projects that we do, when we connect with the candidate, we really debrief as much as possible the candidate's, current and wishful compensation expectations, so that we can make sure it aligns with the hiring manager's requirements, and then of course follow through with touch points throughout the interview process to make sure that alignment remains consistent, or at least understand any variations that may come up towards the end, so that at the end of the hiring process, when both parties have decided they want to work for each other, that we're most prepared to represent the candidate, in the negotiation process to get what they want, but make sure that we understand their hot buttons enough to align them with the needs and the requirements that the hiring manager may request as well.
Yeah, that makes sense. I feel like my default setting should be that I should handle it every time. And if there's a reason why not to, or if the employer has a preference for some reason, but it's such a dicey area. It's the area where we're most likely to lose the deal. So I'd rather assure both the candidate and the employer that this has been covered and discussed, that you guys are well within the ballpark in terms of range and expectations, and that it's not necessary to cover on the first interview or on the screening call. But to a larger point, if we're doing our job right, we've determined that that's not going to be an obstacle. And if that's the primary motivation for, say, the candidate, then that's just another huge red flag. So I'd rather insist on handling it, separately with each of them, and then script out how that conversation is going to go when it's time to have that discussion.
And from my perspective as a hiring manager, I mean, it really depends. There's a couple of types of jobs that we usually end up hiring for. On a certain type of jobs, the range is largely set by HR or the company policies, and we don't really have much of a leeway in the negotiation process. And for those jobs, I'm perfectly comfortable just having somebody from HR handle the entire negotiation process, because really there's not much flexibility there. Where there is flexibility, I want the recruiters in most cases to be pretty heavily involved. And the primary reason for that is most candidates are really bad at salary negotiation. And by that, I mean, they feel like they don't really know the process very well. So they're uncomfortable giving me the right information about what their needs are. There's always some sort of game theory going on where they think if they give me a too high a number, then I might back off, or if they give me too low a number, they'll be undercutting themselves. So they end up almost always giving me the wrong number. So my expectations are almost always incorrectly set when I'm dealing directly with the candidate. Whereas when I'm talking to a recruiter, I largely know where I stand. And the biggest risk for me is we lose out on a really good candidate just for like a small number, and where we might have easily bumped it up by a few $1,000s, and that would have satisfied them. But just because I didn't know what that number was, we never made that effort. Whereas with a recruiter, I would always know where I stand. I would always know where the thresholds are. So dealing with the recruiter on that front makes my job as a hiring manager much, much easier.
I think especially in cases like Devarshi's commenting on them being awkward, you have two extremes. You've got the people who never negotiate and they're uncomfortable in any kind of communication exchange, say developers. Then you've got the other extreme, which can be just as dangerous, the salespeople or the executives who feel like they need to negotiate just to demonstrate their negotiating prowess. and a lot of times I want to undercut that. It's like, look, this is, we don't need to know that about you. We understand you're a good negotiator. You don't need to negotiate for negotiation's sake.
So more specifically, what do you cover up front in your discussion with the hiring manager? Like maybe some bullets. Is it target budgets, maximums, benefits, bonuses, that sort of thing?
Yeah, in terms of what we cover the hiring manager up front, anything that would be compensation or benefit oriented, which includes certainly bonuses and incentives and stock option plans, and even to the detail of how is that calculated, when is it paid, what are the percentages or the fixed amounts depending on what those are, earnouts and whatnot, because all of that is going to add to creating a clear picture of the compensation package. The better we understand that, and the more complete that picture is up front, the more effectively we can screen candidates that either fit in or fit out, at least based on the compensation side, because then we'll be gauging the candidate's fit in those initial screening and qualification conversations with the candidate. So only candidates that are presented are going to fit within that realm. We'll also talk with the hiring manager about possible increases or higher levels, maximums, if you will, in terms of compensation. If they're targeting a certain range, would you go above it? And how much above it would you go? And in what circumstances going above it makes sense for you? And so we can find those kind of exceptional candidates that may be worth a little bit more than the original target for the compensation range.
Smaller companies might be more sensitive to additional costs. Like, in other words, if I've got a candidate who might be approaching the higher end of the salary range, but for whatever reason he's paying his own benefits or doesn't need benefits, he's on spouse's benefits, that could be $500 to $1,000 a month in expenses that they don't have to incur. Other times you run into complications where, say in the sales and marketing area where there's a lot of leverage and incentive associated with a compensation plan, and you've got a really exceptional candidate who's been operating at or above his plan, that's a very delicate transition because now all of a sudden he's going to be working off just the base salary until he's back into commissions again. And so there's always questions of, is there a recoverable draw? Is there a way to bridge the gap, if there is such a gap, without necessarily breaking the bank on the salary side? And that could be in the form of advancing commission or a recoverable or non-recoverable draw. Or as I mentioned earlier, the benefits question or cost. And that all speaks to us being very thorough with the candidate. I can't have that conversation effectively with a hiring manager unless I've had that conversation with the candidate and he's willing to disclose that information and trust me as his agent.
Yeah, and from my perspective, I think compensation, and this goes to a little bit around what exactly is compensation. It's to me, it's a lot more than the money that gets paid to the person for the work done. There's obviously the whole package of what the company and the job is, which can also be packaged as compensation, and that's how I would, as a person who's actually doing the hiring, would present it, would talk to the recruiter about it, trying to highlight the good things that this job would bring to the person. And that could be things like just the team that's already in place and the people in the team and how their personalities would be a good fit or a good match for the people who'd be coming in and would basically add to their overall experience of the job. And that's, to my mind, that is part of compensation. Other things could include the location of the job. And I was just talking to John earlier today, and I was telling him I live in New York, and we just went through a polar vortex when it was negative 11 degrees on Monday. And I was just telling John how that would have been a great day to call up people in New York City and sell them on a job in Southern California. And say, hey, we've got this great job. Would you be interested? And I guarantee you, at least 50% of the people who are otherwise happy in their jobs would say, sure, let's talk. It's way better than the negative 11. So yeah, I mean, obviously, the maximum comp, the benefits, bonuses, esops are important, but I think it goes beyond that, and I think we don't do a very good job of expressing that in most job descriptions and postings as to what the entire package is that could entice the candidate to come to us and work for us. I think that's something that's upon the hiring managers, the hiring companies, and the recruiters to make sure that information is properly captured and passed on. So to give us an advantage in the marketplace as we're looking for the best candidates.
That's a really good point. And I think, it's up to us to educate the candidate. I think a lot of people maybe making their first or second job change automatically default to think that the highest offer is the best job, right? And you could have the exact opposite scenario. You could have a company that's so difficult to work for that they effectively buy you. It's a terrible team. We put you under outrageous amounts of pressure. The hours are awful and the people can be frustrating and there's a lot of micromanagement, but we're going to pay 10 or 15% higher than market. Do you want to be in that environment? I think we need to point out that, everything builds on every move they make, right? So it's not just about this job that he's taking, but it's also about what this job's going to prepare him for in the next job. A lot of times they don't have an answer to the question, when I say, give me, what do you have for a 5 or 7 year goal? Where do you want to be? And there's a strategic aspect to job changing toward getting that. So to Debarshi's point, it's not just about the cash, right? It's everything about what they're going to learn, how valuable they're going to be, what tools and technologies might they pick up in a given role, or growth opportunities therein. That all plays into this.
Mm-hmm. And just to add to that, sorry, I just wanted to add one thing on to Mark's point. The future benefits of joining a job include, and this is something that companies have negotiated with in the past and still can in the future. It's not as applicable to tech as it is to more traditional industries, but the title itself is fairly important because once you give somebody a director level title or a VP level title, it automatically bumps them up for the future. The next job they would obviously be looking at would also be a director or a VP level job, which would mean a higher salary and so on and so forth. So it's not just the number. I can give you a lower number, but I give you a higher title. It would mean you would make more money at your next job, and so on and so forth. So it's just something that you could potentially also negotiate with as you go along.
This all leads to learning and understanding the possible trade-offs of compensation and benefits and the priorities for the candidates that you're talking with, and how do you gather those? So I think the key to that really is having those initial conversations, understanding the where's, the why's, the what's, the how's. Why did they leave their previous position and the positions before that? Why did they decide to join the organizations they joined or accept the projects that they accepted? And really digging into understanding those career changes and career decisions they made, along with really asking them outright. What are your priorities? To me, I like to ask them, what's your dream job? If you could, drop everything or whatever it might be, what would you do? And oftentimes we dig into, certainly the industry. We dig into the role, responsibilities, the team, the corporate culture, the location, and all these things that are coming into play. And it changes, or it's different for every single person we talk to. So we really need to understand them, their priorities. We don't have to understand their family situation, but we need to understand the kind of work elements that allow them to have the work-life balance they need to have to fulfill any family obligations or preferences. So got to ask the questions to dig deep enough to get that information. That information may sound very much as a get to know you kind of approach to screening, but the reality is that information comes in at the end where we better understand their trade-offs. If you're going to take less compensation, what are the circumstances under which you would? If you're going to take more compensation, what are the circumstances for that as well? And that would vary in title and job responsibility and all the other things that I had mentioned and more. So I think that's, it really comes from the very beginning, building the relationship, understanding the candidates' needs and priorities by asking the questions to uncover those things, some of which the candidates will not share. And some unfortunately comes later in the process and may be detrimental to bringing the placement together. So dig deep enough and you'll get what you need to be able to handle the situation throughout the rest of the placement process.
You know what, John? It's making me think that sometimes some people may have, when you give them this opportunity to paint a picture for you, the picture might be too big. So I'm thinking they might be unrealistic at times, these expectations. So how are you handling a candidate with unrealistic expectations? And, the same for the managers too.
On the candidate side, well, first of all, out of experience, we need to understand their role, responsibilities, where they're coming from, and the realities of the market as best we can. But the realities of the situation is, a hiring manager is going to pay you what they feel you're worth within the organization, and you're going to accept what you feel you're worth, for that opportunity, which may or may not align. So unrealistic expectations is, in my experience, is really about understanding their expectations clearly enough and the whys behind where their expectations are, and then presenting an alternative perspective view in as objective approach as possible, expressing it less of a personal opinion and more out of experience. And if they can appreciate that alternative view, great. Then we can help, at least to some degree, adjust their unrealistic mindset. But don't be surprised if that unrealistic mindset is set, albeit maybe buried through much of the placement process, will probably come back to haunt you at the end.
Yeah, unrealistic expectations on the candidate's part, I tend to walk away. And actually, same thing with the hiring managers. My feeling is is if they're unrealistic, that's because they're not aware of what is realistic, and they're going to get realistic soon. I'd rather that be done on somebody else's clock. In other words, let that unrealistic candidate who expects a 50% increase in his salary go interview 5 other places and find that he's only getting offers that are 10 to 12% higher than his current salary. Now he gets realistic. I'll put him on a little tag, follow back up in a month or so and see if that's changed. Same with the hiring manager. If it's an unrealistic expectation, if he wants so much for so little, he's not going to fill the job. So why should we bother chasing it down? Let him struggle with that for as long as he needs to come to an understanding. But it's up to us to circle back and say, here's what I do think is realistic. And a month or two later, they might be right on the same page with you.
I tend to agree with Mark. I do tend to weed out unrealistic candidates with unrealistic expectations before getting into the process. But that depends on the level of unrealism that they have to the situation. If they're really not aware of their surroundings or themselves or their capabilities, I'm going to weed them out. But if we've got a particularly difficult search, and this is one person out of very, very few we've come across, and perhaps even the only one that's available, they probably understand their value in the market, and some of their unrealism is probably weighted in clarity of that. But I will make it very clear to the hiring manager, here are the unrealistic expectations. And it's really up to the hiring manager as to whether they want to take them through the process or not. So really, I'd leave it to the hiring manager at that point in those situations.
And here's an inside scoop on this. Some of the unrealistic expectations that you get from hiring managers or companies are basically just fishing expeditions. And there might actually not be a job behind it at all. And this is something, and so obviously your strategy of not touching those is a good strategy, because sometimes people just do it to feel out what's in the market. They'll post a job, they'll create a job, and then essentially try to see what kind of candidates are out there, what the general range is. And because of that, they don't pay too much attention to what the numbers are, because they're actually not expecting to hire anyone. That said, to me, obviously, if a manager is posting a job, it is upon them to know enough about the market to know what the expected salaries are, what the ranges are, especially for the geographical market that they're in. If they are not doing that, then either, they're new at their job and they'll learn fairly soon. And to Mark your point, they'll come to the, reality and come to face reality fairly soon and take it from there. Or essentially, they may be looking to you as recruiters to actually educate them on that same process, right? So again, if I go in with X as my range for a job, and you come back to me and say, hey, that's well and good, but really, unless you double that number, you're not going to find anyone. Then that's something that I have to internalize, re-budget the job, whatever that needs to happen, and then get back to you. But yeah, I would expect some level of feedback, especially on jobs where my numbers are completely off base. If it's 10-15% off base, then it's possible that obviously I'm just trying to find somebody maybe slightly lower than market and go with that. But if it's completely off base, I definitely want that feedback.
And sometimes we have to go through the search to find the difference between candidates that are within the budget and candidates that can do the job, and what those compensation levels look like. And that's part of the education process for hiring managers, for those at least that have inflated expectations of capabilities within a reduced budget.
Okay, so I'm assuming sometimes it may go back and forth a lot. I don't know, like how, when do you end the negotiation? When is it done? And does renegotiation work, or, is it even recommended? How far should you take it?
The snide comment on it is it's done when both parties accept, right? When an offer is made and the candidate accepts. The reality is most offer negotiations don't go quite as smoothly as we would like. And because you're massaging two different parties with two different perspectives and moving priorities oftentimes. So the negotiation needs to end when the parties have gone back and forth short of the point of irritation. It shouldn't go longer than that. And in my experience, you really want to keep it, if you can, to an offer, a counter, and then a final offer. If you can do that, great. That is if it's not accepted in the initial offer. If it goes beyond that, then it can get convoluted, and we can lose the momentum and the excitement of why the parties wanted to work together. So that being said, in an initial offer and an initial counter, you really want the recruiter really needs to nail down the absolute points to a final decision. What flexibilities there might be, what are the different elements, the benefits, the compensation, the bonuses, and other incentives. All of that stuff has to be nailed down. The counter would come back with ideally two different, if not more, but two different options. Well, I'd take this salary if it was this bonus, or that salary if it's that bonus, or whatever the combination would be. Again, that's where the trade-offs needs to be understood by the recruiter of the candidate, so that you can help them get to the right two options to present back to the hiring manager. And then ideally, once that counteroffer is done, the hiring manager makes a decision between the two options, presents it, and the candidate has already pre-committed to accepting either option, so that there really is no more discussion at that point, or at least there shouldn't be.
Yeah, and this is exactly the reason why I want very early on to establish with both the hiring manager and the candidates that I'm handling that situation, and that that's my area to discuss. Because if we haven't done that, and now all of a sudden we attempt to do that while we're in the negotiation stage of an offer, we're not going to have the authority. So I actually ask for the authority. In other words, from the candidate's perspective, once we have discussed the compensation and the range and what he wants and what he'll accept, I'm looking for authority to accept the position on his behalf. So in other words, if the employer, if the offer is 120 or better, you're prepared to accept the position and start in 2 weeks. Yes. Okay. So if it's below 120, let's say it's 118, do I turn it down, or do you still want to hear about it? Well, I want to hear about it. Okay. So now we know 120 is not the bottom line, right? So I want the accept point. I want the bring it back to you point, and I want the absolutely turn it down point, to try and get realistic. On the other hand, and this gets frustrating because I'm dealing with very often professional negotiators, I'll try and establish, I don't want to get into a counteroffer back and forth situation. I want my hiring manager, unless I've got a person who clearly needs to negotiate, if that's part of his own mental makeup and priorities, I'd like to establish early to say, hey, we're going to put, I call it my best foot forward close. The hiring manager is going to put everything he's got on the table up front. We don't need to play any games. This isn't the movies. We don't need to go back and forth. We'll put our best offer together. We'll include whatever stock options and incentives are going to be involved in that. And then you can make a decision based on the merits of the offer. That doesn't mean they can't come back later if they want to. It's just I'm trying to derail it. I really want to have that part done acceptable to both parties so that it doesn't go back and forth. And, to the question of, does renegotiation work and when is it done? Yeah, good question. That's also why I want to be late in the process. If I know my candidate is interviewing elsewhere, I really want to come in at the end of his interviewing cycle, right, where he's gotten 2 or 3 other offers, and so I know what they are, and I can consider that, and the employer can consider that in extending the offer. So I don't think it's ever done, unless, like John says, it's done when it's accepted and he's gotten negotiated an employer's counteroffer and he shows up at work that day. But man, this is where it's so easy to lose a deal, and you just don't want to. I mean, you put everything you've had into it right up to this point, and it's important to do it right. And the best way I can do that is to try to control all the factors on both sides of that equation.
And from my perspective, it's like it's more of a personal quirk of mine. I almost never negotiate more than 2 rounds, because and I make that fairly clear that I make my first offer, the number comes back, I might accept the counter offer, I might not, or I might make a counter to the counter offer. But I will usually at that point make it clear to both the candidate and the recruiter that this is my final and best offer. We're done with the negotiation. And then it's almost never that I go into a third round, because I made that very clear. And if they still persist in negotiating, it almost always turns me off, the candidate. And now, of course, I mean, there's no 100% rule here, because this might be a candidate like with a skill set that I can't find anywhere, and in which case I might have to go back to the table. But I go back to the table with a sour taste in my mouth, and you know where that leads eventually when this person starts working for you. So from my perspective, it's the faster it's done, it's better. Of course, as I said, it's more of a personal preference/choice. There are people who love negotiation, who might actually prefer to go 5-7 rounds talking the numbers. I know if my mother were in my position, she would probably love that, but I don't. So I think it's very important to actually know the individual from that perspective, right? I mean, if you're a recruiter, you should know what the appetite of the hiring manager is in a situation like this. And if they're willing to, or if you know they're never going to go beyond a certain process, and then it's up to you to stop your candidates as well, and basically inform them that this is the last chance, this is the final number, and if you're not happy with it, then that's too bad.
Let's wrap it up with the final question. How do you calculate compensation? And, basically, how seriously should you be taking published data on compensation numbers?
Yeah, I'll start on that one, just because that's a real factor for me. The whole published data thing, I get that that's on every site, and here's what the national average is, and here's what this locale is, and that locale. But I have not found it to be that very accurate at all. And I think a lot of it just depends on lifestyle. The biggest factor contributing to the published data is housing costs, right? So if I'm, not going to go buy a house on a hill, or if I'm willing to rent an apartment, it's not going to have as big of an impact on areas for cost of living. Hey, I shop at Big Lots. I go to 99-cent store, Aldi's, and drive an economy car. It's not going to affect me in the same way it might if I wanted the big mansion and the luxury vehicle. In terms of calculating compensation in my area, it's often a test. And an early stage client, many of my early stage clients, they're as interested in how much does this guy believe in what we're doing, and is he willing to trade off compensation for, say, an equity stake? Because if you're drinking the Kool-Aid, and if you like the big picture, that could be significantly more. So I was taught a long time ago, it's not what you make, it's what you keep. And if there's varying ways between expenses, between benefits, between matching on a 401k, between stock options and the valuation of the company, and the long-term play, the actual salary number, when you factor in all other considerations, isn't or shouldn't be the main consideration. But that's just my point of view.
Yeah, I tend to agree with Mark. Probably not a lot to add to it, but quite frankly, same thing. The data, the published data it tends to be very questionable. Yeah, maybe it's a factor that you take into consideration, or hiring manager does when it comes to budgeting out a compensation range. But the reality is, it still comes down to the right person for the job and what compensation they're willing to accept. And so calculating compensation, there's so many different factors, and certainly one of the key factors most companies take into consideration is their current team pay scales, to make sure that any kind of compensation range they're putting out for a new position or a replacement position is going to align and not throw off the bell curve of their compensation on their team. If they put it too high end and that person has less experience than the most seasoned person on their team, that it's not going to align well for the team. And granted, no employees of the company should be talking about compensation pretty much in any company, but they do. And so you definitely want to keep it aligned appropriately.
My take on compensation numbers, at least the published data, is it's never complete, is it? I mean, it comes back to calculating the number itself. And if you remember my first question, the answer to my first answer to the first question, it was that compensation is so much more than the number. And the published data is almost always just the base salary. And that tells me almost nothing about the compensation. It doesn't tell me what the bonuses are. It doesn't tell me what if there's stock options, if there's profit sharing, if there's a bunch of other kinds of phantom equity. There's so many different ways in which companies can compensate their employees today. That the published data can be up to like 100% off in many cases. I know some companies which give free healthcare to their employees, and that's a huge number that doesn't even come into the calculations. So I would absolutely say take the published data with a grain of salt. It almost never works out. The other thing to consider there is published data comes from sources like Glassdoor and some other sites. Most of the people who end up on those sites are disgruntled employees who are probably underplaying the number anyway, which will also give you the wrong number. So yeah, it's almost never meaningful from my perspective. So yeah, that's really what it is. As to how you quantify the overall compensation, I think it's really a different exercise in itself, where we basically have to list everything that goes into a compensation package. And as I mentioned in today's world, people have come up with a large number of innovative ways to compensate their employees, mostly to make it more performance oriented. Both from a employee performance perspective and an overall company performance perspective. So it's almost like I will make twice as much money if the company does twice as well. So how do you even say how much money I'm going to make in year one or year two based on my year one numbers? I can't. So that's the thing. And then maybe we should have another discussion in one of these podcasts about all the different compensation modes that are currently being used and how companies can best leverage these in the future to entice their candidates.
All right, let's jump into our next segment, our recruiters' favorite tools, where we're just going to basically pick one tool, app, or just kind of like process that our recruitment team uses to make their work more efficient. And we're going to discuss some pros and cons of those tools and make some suggestions for how it can be improved. So what is the favorite tool for today? Mark, you want to give some insight?
Yes, I'm a Career Builders user, and I know there's quite a few people out there that are. And much like every other resume board, it's great for searching resumes and finding people. But they have a tool in the upper left-hand corner of the dropdown that says Recruitment Edge. And what this is it searches an aggregate of all these social sites, including LinkedIn and Google Plus and a number of them, and using the same criteria, right? So the difference is that you'll get a return of each profile, and it will include one form of contact information, either a phone number, an email, or both. But this is a phenomenal tool for sourcing passive candidates, especially if you're not willing to pay, for the big LinkedIn premium recruiter package. And it also, covers multiple platforms, especially great, I think, for technical roles and developers for all the developer sites that are out there. But It's a nice intro into, the information might not be very current. And, again, you're dealing with passive candidates, but it will sub-search a list, say, to make sure that you're not having to just do an in-mail and you can actually reach them with contact information. It's pretty cool. It's called Recruitment Edge on Career Builders.
Cool. So we'll do one more key wrap up with the biggest lesson learned or just some sort of key insight from your own experience that you can give listeners into the compensation negotiation process. And Mark, you want to kick it off again with something?
Sure. I heard a long time ago that you can't effectively negotiate unless you're willing to walk away. And really that applies to all three parties when you think about it, right? If I'm a recruiter and I've got alternative candidates in the process, then I'm willing to walk away on an unrealistic candidate. If I'm a candidate and I've got other alternatives, or I'm already employed, then I'm willing to walk away. It's when it's all or nothing, like the woman Devarshi mentioned, whether a unique skill set that we've just got to have this guy, and now I'm going to hire him and pay more than I expect to, and I'm going to be bitter about it. That's exactly the position we don't want to find ourselves in. So, from the employer, it would be alternative candidates. For the candidate, it would be alternative jobs. For us, it would be options for either or both. But I'm much more effective when it's not an all or nothing, I need this deal, because, that's the other hard part too. We're trying to establish credibility and trust as a trusted advisor on both sides of a difficult equation. And we've got a deal at stake here. And so it's very important that we put that, win-lose aside and try and do our best for both of those parties and win-win-win in the outcome.
All right. Well, thanks for listening in. If you have any comments or suggestions for the topics that you want us to discuss in the future, reach out to us via email at interview@inamics.com or on Twitter. So we'll be back soon with more content and suggestions about how to make your staffing operations simpler and more efficient.